Alright, we are going to now proceed ahead with the second chapter in history for Maharashtra State Board, and that will be chapter 2, that's Historiography, Indian Tradition. So if you correlate, in the first chapter what we have studied is Historiography, development in the West. So if you kind of correlate things out here, Historiography, development in the West. So we have understood what and how history has been understood by the Western scholars, what were the perspectives, how changes happened in those perspectives, and how history or historical narrative was framed. So this is as per the contributions in the West, how the study of history, the study of past events, and the study of historical things changed and transpired, and what were the concepts involved. So there was significant amount of contribution that was made by Western scholars. So studying history the Western way, and now in this chapter we are going to study history the Indian way. So how history writings, how history decodings have happened in India, that is something that we are going to study here. Okay, so that's the crux, or that's the outline of the chapter. So we are just going to discuss the outline of the chapter, what are we going to study here. So if we look at the historiography in different time periods in India, historiography or rather the history of entire India can be divided into 3 time frames. Okay, 3 time frames. One is the ancient period in India, the very ancient period of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa. Okay, see these excavations happened around the 19th, and when these excavations happened, okay, when Britishers were ruling India, okay, the Archaeological Survey of India basically started depicting this. So when these excavations happened, then we were able to link ourselves to a very primitive Indus Valley civilization. So these were the 2 sites, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, on which the excavations were made, and this dates back to very old culture and tradition. So that's the reason ancient history is basically that history which has been decoded at that point of time. So that's basically the ancient period, very old period. Okay, historiography in the medieval period in India. Medieval period means the after ancient period, then we have the medieval period, and then we have the modern period. So we have divided the entire history into 3 time frames. The very old Mohenjo-daro, Harappa time frame, that becomes the ancient. Medieval history then becomes the medieval history, and then becomes the modern history. Okay, so these are the 3 time frames of history. Modern history, the very recent history, for example, the scenario of Cold War and all, that comes under modern history. Okay, if we go into medieval history, a long time back, maybe Shivaji Maharaj and all, so that all comes into the medieval history. Okay, so that's basically how history has been divided. Now, what are the characteristics of ancient period? So ancient period, how do we understand ancient period? This is primarily with the help of oral recitals. Okay, oral recitals means here that obviously writing, although it was discovered, but most of the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa writings that we have been able to discover, we have not been able to decode it as of yet. Okay, so our reliability on oral recitals is more here. Okay, so preserved with the help of oral recitals. These are basically mythological laws. Okay, the things which are concerned with mythology, so these were basically preserved. So all this history was basically more or less oral. The written contribution is less, and the problem is that the written contribution is there, but we have still not been able to decode what was the script or the language that was getting used. So our dependency on oral recitals here is a little more. Okay, so this is preserved with the help of oral recitals. So generation after generation, these recitals have been carried forward, and hence we say that these have been preserved with the help of oral recitals. Okay, inscriptions of Harappan seals, artifacts, etc. There were inscriptions that were there on Harappan seals, artifacts, where Indians had mastered the art of writing as early as 3rd millennium BC. Okay, so when we look at the inscriptions of Harappan seals and all, we see that Indians had basically mastered the art of writing as early as 3rd century BC. 3rd century BC is when they had actually mastered the art of writing. So inscriptions that were there on Harappan seals, artifacts, etc. So Indians had mastered. So basically we were or rather Indians had learned what is writing, they had developed a language, they had developed a script. The unfortunate part here is that we have not been able to decipher it, which means that we have not been able to decode that language. Okay, most of the inscriptions we have not yet been able to decode the language or the script that is being used there. But the inscriptions itself suggest that there was a language of communication as well as of writing. Okay, there was a particular script and style that was followed. Okay, so that is one feature that we get. Okay, earliest known written documents are basically known as inscriptions. Okay, so these are the earliest known written documents, and these were inscriptions on caves, inscriptions on rocks, etc. Okay, so these were basically inscriptions. So these are earliest known written documents. So earliest known written documents were in the form of inscriptions. Obviously paper was not discovered at that point of time. So whatever writings they had to leave for the next generation was in terms of, you know, inscriptions that they did on rocks and caves, etc. Other important sources of history, let's say we all know what is Ramayana. We have these epics of Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, Jain and Buddhist texts. So all these basically, although are kind of, you know, divine material, but still we kind of correlate to them very strongly. Okay, so these are basically things which we refer to when we are studying history. So these are also considered as a source of history. Okay, these are also considered as a source of history. Epics like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Purana, Jain and Buddhist texts, etc. These are also sources of history. Travelogues written by foreign travelers. Okay, so there are some authors that have written things about it. There were some authors that have written things about their rulers. They were dedicated authors who used to write about all the things happening, contemporary events during their times of their rulers. Okay, they were travelogues written by foreign travelers. So foreign travelers, for example, one important traveler was Fahim. He had written a lot about Indian and Fahim was from China. So he came to India and he wrote a lot about those times. Okay, true picture of social, economic, political and religious cultural life. So whatever was the true picture of social, for example, one of the most important historical events that has been written by is Banabhatta. Okay, so Banabhatta was basically who? Banabhatta wrote Harsh Charitra. Okay, Harsh Charitra, and Harsh Charitra was basically on the king Harshvardhan. Okay, so Banabhatta was basically the writer of King Harshvardhan's time, and he has written a lot about that time. Okay, so Harsh Charitra was written, and that was written way back in his times. So that represents the different social, economic and political, religious lifestyle, religious and culture life of people of those times. Okay, so these are certain things that we have for Indian history. This was just an outline of the chapter. We will go more into the details of it in the next slide. Okay, and take a snapshot of the same. Okay, so again we keep on continuing with this. The earliest known inscriptions that are found in India are dated to 3rd century BC. Okay, very old time frame. That's basically how we decode ancient history. Okay, so here we are trying to understand the characteristics and aspects of ancient history, what are the available resources and how we have so far been successful in decoding it. So the earliest known, when we are talking about inscriptions, okay, inscriptions, basically inscriptions are made on rocks, stones and pillars, okay, by basically the people who were involved in doing so. I mean, they actually inscribed on rocks because these are going to be permanent. Okay, when you write something on a piece of paper, it might not be permanent after a different time, but these are going to be permanent. So the people who were writing, or rather those rulers who were inscribing those on stones and pillars, knew that they are going to be permanent, and this information is going to be a reliable source to understand their times, to understand their development at a later stage of human development. Okay, so earliest known inscriptions are dated back to 3rd century BC, and this is prevailing to King Ashoka Maurya. We all know he was one of the Mauryan kingdom, basically one of the kingdoms which had expanded to a vast extent across India. Okay, these were inscribed on rocks, stone pillars, etc. Okay, these inscriptions were there, and then see, at that point of time, rocks and stones pillars were the inscriptions, and then in 1st century CE, inscriptions appeared on coins, okay, on metal images, sculptures, copper plates, etc. Now different things are used. Coins have been discovered till now. So basically metallurgy has started. Extracting metals and using them has already started. So the knowledge of science is now starting. Okay, so coins, metal images. So metals can be only we can craft images only on metals when we discover them. Then sculptures and then copper plates were used. Okay, dates of so what are these inscriptions? These inscriptions basically refer to the dates of various kingdoms and dynasties. Okay, the dynastic genealogies. So who came after whom? Okay, so let's say the Mauryan Empire, who was the first emperor and how it was taken over by his son and how it was taken over by his son, and so on and so forth. The various dynastic genealogies. Okay, the territorial extent of their empires, the entire extent of their empire across India and the Indian subcontinent basically. The political events that had happened during their times, these are all the information that we are getting from the inscriptions. The social organization of people, okay, how so the social setup was, the agriculture, which is a very important part to play because that is connected with food crops, and at that point of time, the agriculture was not as advanced as it is during our times. So famines and all used to impact hugely. Okay, so the climate had a very important role to play, because if the climate was not favorable, then food crops would not be done properly, and then it will have its own impact. Okay, so one example is, which is mentioned in the book, is Sohagauda copper plate. Sohagauda basically is a district in Gorakhpur, and there was a copper plate that was found, and on this, so this is just an example of how things are decoded. So on this we found, on this coin that is found, it belongs to the Mauryan period, and the script is of Brahmi script. At that point of time, this script was used. Okay, the inscription basically has a lot of figures and all, but what we correlate to is there is a royal order on that inscription which states that the granary, okay, there used to be a granary, that is a storehouse of grains during olden times, wherein the grains used to be stored. Okay, so grains means food grains. The grains stored in the granary should be distributed carefully. All the people should get it, including the rich and the poor as well. Okay, so this is basically a royal order. They are insisting on this grain distribution carefully is because there is a high chance of famines happening, and that used to happen. There is a high chance of climate impact, because of which there would be a shortage of food grains, and then it might not be available to the most needy people. So look at the royal order that is there, which means that we had already acquired the good administrative capabilities at that point of time. Okay, so good administration means that even the poor should have an access to the basic amenities of life. So this is how we actually decode these inscriptions which have been found for the ancient era. You can take a snapshot of the same.